Welcome to lesson 2. Here we're going to discuss targeting the appropriate caloric surplus for muscle growth. While a caloric surplus is not an absolute necessity for muscle growth, it's something that's required to optimize the process. So when we're talking about a caloric surplus, we specifically mean consuming more calories than we're burning by the end of the day or by the end of the week. And so what this surplus does is it provides the energy and the raw materials for the anabolic process. So it supports escalating volume demands for training, and it also supports muscle protein synthesis as well as anabolic signaling at the molecular level. So let's have a look at the details. All right. So let's begin by discussing a recent study by Helms and colleagues, where they compared various energy surpluses and their effects on body composition with progressive resistance training in well-trained resistance trainees. So this was an 8-week study, and the conditions compared were an assigned 0%, 5%, and 15% caloric surplus. And interesting, strength gains within and between the groups were insignificant except for the highest, except for at the highest surplus. So the assigned 15% caloric surplus group, which experienced a significant increase in bench press 1 rep maximum. And both of the surplus groups, the 5% and the 15% groups, increased skin fold thickness. And so the increase was slightly greater with the 15% surplus compared to the 5% surplus. And this indicates a certain degree of fat gain as a result of these caloric surpluses. And interestingly, there were no significant differences in muscle groups and muscle growth between the groups, with the exception of a very slight gain in biceps thickness, 0.2 to 0.3 centimeters, compared to baseline levels. And just to reiterate, there was no difference between groups as far as this minuscule change goes. So, put more simply, this program did not provide much muscle growth at all, regardless of the caloric surplus. It just provided a minuscule gain in biceps thickness in all of the groups. So why did this happen? And when we take a closer look at what occurred in the study, there was a high attrition or high dropout rate due to COVID lockdowns. And the training protocol was not particularly high volume. So it was a full body 3 times a week, 9 sets per muscle group per week. And one could question the external validity of this particular training program in highly resistance trained subjects. Quoting the authors themselves, in many cases, our participants habitually trained with more frequency and in some cases more volume than they performed during this investigation. So effectively, what happened was the habitual training programs of the subjects of this study had significantly more volume than they engaged in the actual study, which would represent like a backing off period or even a deload. So, another major caveat with this study and its findings of, well, mainly fat gains with the caloric surpluses are that the 0% surplus group or the maintenance group consumed an average of 169 calories above and beyond baseline levels. So their assigned 0% surplus was actually a 7.2% surplus. The group that was assigned a 5% surplus consumed a 489 calorie surplus, which represents an 18.5% surplus above and beyond maintenance intakes. And finally, the 15% surplus group actually ended up consuming a 28.4% surplus because they actually consumed 719 calories above and beyond their baseline habitual intakes. And so the moral of the story is with this particular study, the subjects consumed 2 to 3 times greater caloric surpluses than they were actually assigned. And this was combined with a significant drop in training volume compared to their habitual training volume. So that is actually a recipe for fat gain and not a whole lot of muscle gain, which is exactly what happened in this study. And so I put a note to myself to discuss Antonio et al.'s work on protein overfeeding. And suffice it to say that Antonio et al.'s work is really interesting because they imposed protein-based caloric surpluses on their resistance-trained subjects, and no significant lean mass gains were seen in most of the studies, but no significant fat gains were seen either. The apparent disappearance of this protein surplus was likely due to a subconscious decrease in the surrounding macros, or just a misreporting or an overreporting of protein intake, which happens in research, or or an increase in energy expenditure through either exercise pathways or non-exercise pathways. And so contrasting results were seen with protein-based surpluses. And in one of Antonio et al.'s studies, which we'll take a look at, we actually saw recomposition as a result of a protein-dominant caloric surplus in resistance-trained subjects. So I'm going to contrast Antonio et al.'s work with Bray et al.'s work. So George Bray, back in 2013-ish, did a study that had escalating protein intakes and escalating caloric surpluses in sedentary subjects that were confined to a metabolic ward. And not training, metabolic ward, escalating protein intakes and net caloric surpluses escalating, and they did gain fat as well as lean mass. So there's a contrast between free living resistance training subjects who are assigned a protein-based surplus compared to what Bray and colleagues saw, which was fat gain and lean mass gain with escalating protein intakes within the context of a net caloric surplus. So I know that was a lot to take in, but the main thing that I want you to get out of this is what's assigned in research, as in the case of Helms et al., isn't always carried out by the subjects involved with the research study. And then we get results that are easy to report to the fitness community. And it's easy to miss the caveats that I just went over. So progressive resistance training should be in place to provide the adaptive stimulus for muscle gain. And hypercaloric conditions are necessary for optimizing the process because, once again, you're accommodating increasing energy demands of increasing volume of training. And you also want to support muscle protein synthesis and anabolic signaling. Ideally, you would target a 10 to 20% caloric surplus. And this mainly applies to intermediate and more advanced trainees. In rank beginners, there is research indicating that even higher surpluses than 20% might be necessary and could actually be more effective, especially for people who are so-called hard gainers. Hard gainers are individuals who tend to ramp up subconsciously their non-exercise activity. Technically, their non-exercise activity thermogenesis. We use the NEAT acronym there. And so hard gainers are actually neat freaks, as I call them. And so the 10 to 20% caloric surplus that you would normally assign can tend to get swallowed up by hard gainers in response to this imposed caloric surplus. But for the majority of people that you are going to place on a program for muscle gain, 10 to 20% caloric surplus is appropriate. And with that, we end the lesson and we will move on to a phenomenon called recomposition next.